Welcome to another observability clinic, Log Analytics with Dynatrace, update May 2022. I know a lot of you know about Dynatrace. Dynatrace has many different solutions. One of the capabilities is log analytics. And we also have a lot of new things that are happening all the time. This is why we thought, hey, it's time for an update. This is why this update is May 2022. And I'm not the expert in this, but I brought the expert in. And therefore, I want to give the word to Josh Lange. Josh, welcome to the Observability Clinic. Can you quickly introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So Josh Lange, I've been with Dynatrace over 10 years now in the services area. You know, I started back in my career, Andy, watching your performance clinics and observability clinics, way back then in the Abmon days, right? Yeah. So I'm excited to be here and excited to talk to everybody about log analytics today.
Perfect. And I think with this, you are the expert. I just want to say, folks, if you watch this recording, if you have questions, leave a comment either on YouTube if you see it there, if you see it on the university, leave a comment there, or you have our names. I'm pretty sure you'll figure out how you get a hold of us. But with this, Josh, I'm very excited. Tell me more about log analytics, what the current state and the latest things are. And, I may interject with a question too if I have it. And, but yeah, I will not interrupt your flow. So take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. All right. So first thing is, let's figure out what we plan to learn today. So I wanted to go over some of our latest improvements on log analytics. We're going to take a look at the new log viewer, which is a streaming fashion now. So before, if you've worked with log analytics v1, we have a new kind of v2 side that's going to bring streams into this concept. I've set up an environment where I'm also forwarding cloud provider logs. So I've got an AWS environment streaming logs into Dynatrace. So we'll showcase that. Some enhanced support for Kubernetes. We decorate the log content a little bit more with some metadata there. We're going to take a look at creating metrics and attributes with this log content. So, how do we analyze, but also how do I get proactive notifications around this information and, present that on a dashboard as well. And then we'll take a look at the last two items, enrich log messages with topology context and trace context. So that means we can actually drill down into our traces from our log content as well. And finally, we'll use the API to explore the HTTP endpoint we provide for common log shippers as well. All right. And then finally, we've got a little bit of a preview of what's coming into log analytics later on this year and beyond, right? So we'll talk about what we're working on now, what's going on next, and what do we consider to work on later. So we're always interested to hear everybody's feedback on what you would like to see into the product. All right. So let's first start off with, what does our environment look like? So I have a local environment here that I'm running in AWS, running EKS, basically have easy travel, operating our application side, which is collecting logs via our one agent. And then I also have a couple of Lambda functions out there that's doing our log forwarding directly from AWS into our active gate. And all of that's being passed up directly to my Dynatrace tenant. So it's kind of like a common environment, right? We've got an application that's running in Kubernetes. I'm collecting the Kubernetes logs, the events, and then I also have a few services in AWS that's pushing some log data directly into my tenant that's unrelated to the components running inside of EKS, right? So starting off with this and understanding kind of what our environment looks like, I want to just kind of go through what are some of the newer features of the log viewer, and then we'll jump right back into the product and do a couple of demos. Come back, talk about a couple of more things, and then we'll just continue on with the demos from there. So log analysis based on streams, right? The log viewer can enable us to not only filter, but we've got a whole bunch of new attributes that you can utilize. No longer do we have to select specific logs to view in the log viewer, so that's nice. It's always a constant stream. You specify your time frame, and you're going to get results, directly immediately. You'll notice on the left here, and we'll get into this once we jump into the UI, but we've got a lot of different filters that we can build off of to identify what it is that we may be looking for. The cool thing I also like about this is you can format the table directly to what you're interested in, right? So maybe the initial timestamp status and content, we want to enhance that a little bit to provide some additional context. You can really play with this. We'll take a look at exactly what we can do with dashboarding and so on later, but it's definitely helpful when troubleshooting your application or service. So moving into another major feature of Log Analytics v2 in our current state is the ability to provide your cloud logs over to Dynatrace. This is supported for all of the 3 major providers. There are instructions in our documentation for setting this up. So it's a forwarding concept where right now I'm pushing AWS logs for some of my other services, but you can support this for Azure environments as well as Google Cloud. And it's just definitely a nice way to get some additional visibility and allow Davis to better understand some of the context to your existing services that exist inside of your environment, right? And one of the major benefits is that cloud providers, they produce a lot of logs, and we can't place the one agent necessarily everywhere, right? So we may have some services where I can't get visibility with one agent, but I have maybe some log groups in AWS that I want to push over to Dynatrace. And that's one of the newest features here. So we'll see some of that in action as well.
Hey, Josh, just one quick question, because
Yeah.
I thought that's actually good. And maybe I'm taking it away anyway in the next slide, because I saw something. That means as we are ingesting the logs, one of the strengths of Dynatrace, what I love about it, that we have our Smartscape model. That means we know the dependencies, and we have always data in the context of the entities. Is this also true with logs? So when we are ingesting logs, can we kind of connect it to the entities that we already have in Dynatrace?
You're absolutely correct, Andy. Yep. And not only that, but we decorate them with attributes related to those entities. So if we identify that, this particular log item relates to an existing Dynatrace entity, you're going to see, as you expand some of the details in each of the log entries, additional attributes related to that. And those also apply to filters that can you can build metrics with, you can build dimensions with inside of metrics, and also create your alerts from.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So we talked about enhanced support for Kubernetes, and right off, what you just mentioned there is the additional attributes. This is kind of what you would typically see for especially a Kubernetes environment. But if you're not running, a Kubernetes environment, you're going to have all of the Dynatrace entities directly linked from your log content here, as well as any additional attributes that you can custom define. So we'll take a look at that later. But basically, every log entry provides some decorated content the Dynatrace automatically puts in place. And for the Kubernetes side here, we're looking at things like our containers, our deployment names, namespaces, which pod this came from, the sources, so excellent context for not only just viewing your log content, but these are also applicable to your filters, and they can be built in your metrics. All right. So with that, let's just jump right into the product, right? We're going to go right over there and take a look. So I've got my environment stood up here, looking at my Kubernetes cluster, and I'm going to navigate on the left-hand side over to our logs section. This is just the last couple of hours of data, and I should see, a full stream of my content coming through. So right now, this is completely unfiltered, and all of the up-to-date content that I'm streaming. So I've got my one agent collecting logs automatically from my application pods. I've got my AWS account forwarding content. So what we want to do here is, let's say we want to start with some basic filtering. Inside of my Kubernetes cluster, I've got a deployment for easy travel, right? And that consists of a back end and a front end and a couple of different components. So I may want to start utilizing some of the filters from the very top. It's the same section as what we see on the left. So if we start to collapse some things here, because there's a lot of entries right in this mix. So we've got kind of a main that focuses around the status and the severity, Dynatrace specific entity filters, cloud services, AWS, Kubernetes. So let's say we expand into Kubernetes, and I'm interested to see, maybe all of my logs from the easy travel namespace. So that quickly narrows me down into that area. So now I'm only focusing on this particular namespace. And then additionally, maybe I'm interested in only the backend deployment that I've got. So I don't need to worry about the MongoDB logs or my load generator. So here we can see we definitely have some errors coming through on my backend, some client abort exceptions that are pretty consistent. If we start to get interested in this information and want to learn more, then I can expand this to get additional context into where this is sourced. So it identifies all of the DT entities, as well as if we scroll our way down, we'll find our additional attributes related to Kubernetes, all of my Dynatrace components, all the way down to my container ID, the technologies, right? So this is just excellent information to understand for this particular entry. Now, of course, I've got a lot of common entries here. So these could potentially be found on, let's say, different Kubernetes nodes, or maybe I have different patterns to investigate. And for that, I might choose to adjust the table format, right? So I could bring in something like, let's say, node, where I could look for the Kubernetes node name. Oh, actually, that one looks like it's gonna, let's see if this one comes through. Oh, neither of those. Hopefully this one here. Oh, okay. Actually, we got to grab one of the attributes here from the selection. So let's just go down to this list and we'll find something within here. So we could take a look and see if these are coming through. The DT entity host should definitely be one that comes through. Maybe I have, similar deployments and namespaces across different clusters by chance. So that could potentially be one. So let's see if we got the deployment just to verify that that's there. All right, so that's filtered currently, but let's say if I remove that filter now, I can identify all of the entries directly from this column, right? So anytime you want to format the table, it's the same options as what we have on the left-hand side. So if you choose any of the Dynatrace entities, the main entries, so let's say if I want to look at the different log levels, that's there with status. So, especially when it comes to like individual process groups, hosts, something of that nature, it's just nice to be able to format exactly what you want to be able to view here, right? So now we've only applied really a very basic level filter at this point of just the particular namespace, and then we had the deployment in there as well. So let's explore what else we can take a look at. I talked to you guys earlier that I had my AWS account sending information here. So how do I find entries that is being forwarded from my log groups? I'm going to navigate through these areas and focus on AWS this time. And let's say I just want to show everything that's coming through this particular account. All right. With that, we have, certainly some content over the last couple of hours. Let's expand this out a little bit to see if we've got a trend. Do see some information coming through directly from my log groups. And if I expand, let's say one of the errors here, then we can get into identification of, particular what streams and, which region this is coming from. So all relevant context to my particular account that's coming through. And of course, that is going to match up with what you have configured inside of Dynatrace. So if you might have multiple cloud provider accounts connected, all streaming log content. So these are very applicable filters to working with the log viewer, right? Now, additionally, not only off of the main selection or any of these selections on the left-hand side, if we clear these filters out, you can work with the advanced query language if you would like, right? So if you just decide to, let's show errors, and I want to make sure that it's coming from this host, and let's say that it's coming from, my particular namespace. Now, all of these should match pretty closely on the same content, but what I wanted to show is if we switch over to the advanced query mode now, I can actually write in a syntax. So if you're more comfortable with that, or if you feel that you can input some additional conditions that match exactly what you're looking for, you always have this capability available to you. And if you're not familiar with it, then working off of the basic mode or the selection mode with the dropdown kind of gives you an idea of what it's building, and you can switch over to the advanced query so you can populate that. It's definitely a good thing to keep in mind because you will need to use this when it comes to building metrics later on.
Mm-hmm. Right? Hey, Josh, just one quick question, and I'm sure it's coming later anyway, but at this point, my question will be, can I define these queries and then maybe put it on a dashboard so that I can always easily get access to exactly this particular view that I'm interested in?
Yep, exactly. So right now I'm targeting all log errors from this particular node in my Kubernetes cluster and making sure that I'm filtered to the namespace. So let's say that this is something I want to place on a dashboard. We come down here to the right-hand side and we can see this action button. Then I can just go ahead and say pin to dashboard. So you're probably familiar with that option, right? If you're building custom charts and so on. So it's very similar. So we just go ahead and let's say we're going to create a new dashboard. And this would be my easy travel errors for node 01 or something, right? And then I can open this up. And exactly how I formatted the table in the log viewer is how I can visualize this content directly outside of my dashboard, right? Yeah, so great point, Andy. And what we'll do is we'll continue to add some components here, right? Not only can the log viewer results land on your dashboard, but of course the custom metrics we build from the content.
Cool. And I also saw there's an option to export CVS and JSON. I mean, that's, it seems the product team really thought about making it easy to access this data. So really cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's a great feature because you can grab the same content either from the API, or if you just have a quick query and you want to grab the raw results, yeah, directly from that option there, you have the available way to do so. Okay, cool. So that's kind of the basics of the viewer. We're going to continue to use those concepts as we go through this session. One thing that I wanted to come back to here was our deck, so we can explore some of the metric capabilities. So this is more than just log analysis, right? Not only can we do our queries, we can populate our viewer and populate dashboards and customize our columns and the way that we visualize this information, but it comes down to a point where I may want to actually generate some time series metrics, right? Populate some nice looking charts, fulfill my dashboard that I had started with just the query that was there. And not only can we look for specific events, let's say, show me the number of errors that is produced by this deployment backend. Well, not only that, but I could also add dimensions to it, right? So let's say here we have an example of this is all of my K8s logs by some metadata. The query is looking to make sure that I'm only focusing on logs for this particular host. And I want to split or create dimensions by the container, the namespace, and in this case, the cloud application instance. So when you build a metric, you can specify one or many dimensions for that. And then of course, you'll have the same types of charting capabilities you already are aware of in the Data Explorer, with the applicable filters that you can apply there. So we can end up building something very similar. Right. So that ends up looking, something like this, being able to put all that content on a dashboard. So we just resulted in, throwing the log viewer results out there. And then of course, we will look for some trending charts or possibly some different visualizations to throw out on the dashboard. And, from there, we'll also be able to enrich the log messages with some topology context. So what Dynatrace is doing and what Davis is doing is fully understanding the context of all of the log entries that are coming through, right? So if we end up, not only are we building metrics around this and being able to customize our alerts, but when we do see a problem, Davis is already going to recognize that, hey, this is related to this particular entity and it may become part of a root cause in an existing problem, or it could be, part of an impacted entity. It's going to show relevant content, right? If you have, let's say, failure rate increases in your application, Dynatrace produces a problem for that. As you drill down into the details of those failures, we're actually going to show you log entries relevant to this problem at that particular time, which is awesome because sometimes you run into situations like in HTTP 500 is pretty generic. Maybe there's no exceptions related to it. There's not a lot of context to what's going on with that error, but we start to bring into the log content, the app might be actually writing some additional detail that we could correlate with exactly what's going on there. So Dynatrace just brings it into the same screen for us.
And I think this is the beauty of what I also mentioned earlier with that we have the topology model. That means if we detect an issue with one entity, like your application has a high failure rate, as you explained, not only do we give you the logs in context of this particular service that has a high failure rate, but we make it very easy to then navigate through all the dependencies, because maybe it's a backend system that is acting weird, that is connected to it, but you get all of the logs and the metrics in the context of this problem that you need to analyze. So this is really great for root cause analysis, making it easier to find out what's wrong. Yeah.
No, absolutely. So, that's great. And let's go ahead and take a look now at building a couple of metrics. What would that look like, right? So I think we're all pretty familiar with being able to find some of the relevant information. It's very simple to select some of our different filters here. When it comes down to, creating some type of metric or something like that, right? What do we want to do with this? Well, the first thing is we need to just build out the same filters that I'm interested in. So let's focus on errors that is occurring across my entire environment. This could be coming from AWS or my Kubernetes cluster. In this case, we see that it's my deployment backend. So, I'm more interested to see this in a trend, right? Maybe this is an error that's happening throughout, multiple days, or how does this spike up at certain points during the day? So let's go ahead and create maybe a metric that looks at the content of the log. And then I could also decide to group this by maybe a deployment name or something like that to identify if this particular Java IO exception is coming through on multiple different deployments. So you have many ways to build this, right? I mean, I could simply say my filter is currently set to log level error, and maybe I've continued to filter this down by other entities, but we want it to be specific related to this message. So I'm essentially going to copy maybe the first portion of this, up to the broken pipe. And let's say I'm going to also input up here at the very top that I want to filter by content. And I'm just going to paste that in to build out my initial query. So this should now be focused directly on just these log entries. And I want to create a metric around that. All you have to do, you'll see the create metric option. Just go ahead and select create metric. That's going to transition me into our global settings panel for the environment. And it pre-populates my query here. So what I mentioned earlier about the advanced syntax of the logs, anytime you're building log metrics, it's a good idea to get comfortable with that because this is the inputs, right, to this metric here. We don't have the same selections as we did before, but you can build them directly from the log viewer, and that's why that option is available to us. So all we need to do is provide this with a key, and it's going to pre-populate. It starts with log to indicate that this is in fact a log metric. And here I'm just going to say that we're basically looking for, error.broken pipe, right? And I don't have any other filters in here, so this particular exception could really come from any source. So I'm interested in a dimension in this case, right? I want to measure the occurrence of log records, or my other options are potentially an attribute value. We'll get into that in just a moment where we can specify attributes to measure. But in this case, I want to know what is the deployment that is actually, triggering this exception, which log entry is this found in, and do I have this log entry in multiple different deployments? So let's just go ahead and use the K8's deployment name as my dimension here. And of course, if I needed additional ones, I could add in the additional ones. So maybe we want pod as well. Go pod name. If I have particular pod names that I would be interested in, and we'll just save those changes off, right? Once that is saved, this is a time series metric. So that gets stored in our long-term storage, just like you would see for any of the other metrics that is found within the Data Explorer. And now at this point, it's going to start to collect every time that we see that log entry. So if I jump back to the log screen, these are happening pretty frequently. And therefore, I should be able to go ahead and go out to my Data Explorer. And let's look for our metric here. We can just look for log dot, because when I created it, it should just be based off that key, okay? Now, since I just created it, 30 seconds ago, it may take a minute or two to populate in this Data Explorer. So let's just give it a refresh here and see if we can find it. There it is, log error broken pipe. Now I want to change the aggregation because I'm not interested in really the average here of how many times this occurs. I want to know the sum across the resolution of our chart. And then since we decided upon running a deployment name as my dimension, I could throw that out there, or the pod name, either one would be applicable. So let's just run that query. And here's the first couple of results that we're starting to get, right? So I think my goal with this metric is to understand the total sum of these entries in a particular time frame. So for that, I'm just going to change the visualization of this chart back down to a single value. And this is going to give me a trend and show, how frequently are we increasing this, and it gives me an idea of the total count of this particular exception throughout our logs based on the deployment. And we can pin that out to our dashboard, right? So we'll just go ahead and say that we want to throw that on our dashboard, which would be our broken pipe exception sum. Pin that out there. All right, perfect. And then we can just kind of bring that below our table. Maybe this is a metric that I keep an eye on as part of it. And of course, we could duplicate that and change the visualizations. Maybe I want to show, a pie chart that displays which of my deployment names this is coming from, right? Right now in this environment, it's pretty generic exception. So I think the sum is going to work out well for us. All right, so let's jump back there. Now, one more thing that I can do is let's actually take an example of if I introduce a problem, an additional problem to our application, I should be able to get that in there.
And as you're doing this, and I know you're generating a problem in the back, I find this fascinating, especially because it gives you so much flexibility that you can create custom metrics with all these dimensions. And then as you have a metric, and you mentioned this, you can define alerting. You can even use, I assume, our baseline alerting. So you can actually say, I want to be alerted in case the number of log messages, like error log messages, goes beyond either a certain threshold, or we also have the capability of doing custom alerts on kind of calculated baselines on custom metrics. So this is extremely powerful, especially if you think about you're deploying a new version of the app and all of a sudden things go in a different way, because you always have a certain noise, right? Sometimes of logs, like even error logs, but you want to understand if there's an anomaly. And this is really cool.
No, absolutely. And that's one of the key things is when you're deciding on, the alerting strategy for my logging content, you can either go the metric route, which can give you a total. And like you said, you can baseline things, or you could say, alert me if this happens 5 times in a particular time period. Additionally, you could also just create a log event and then a problem opening event, right? So if this log entry happens one time, or the very first time it happens, it will open up a problem. So we can take a look at that same configuration, because there's 2 different approaches to it that I like to show. The only other metric I was thinking of creating here is if we jump into maybe just the total log entries, maybe by my deployment name, and then just kind of gives me an idea of what is logging the most, or if I was targeting how many errors that we're seeing throughout. Let's go actually that route. So we'll just say I want to know the number of errors that is being generated, and we're going to go ahead and create a metric off that. We will also use the deployment errors total, and we'll add a dimension there for our deployment name.
As you're typing this, I'm a big fan of configuration as code and automation. So folks, if you're seeing this, it's great that we can do all of this to the UI, but you can also fully automatically configure this because we are providing very rich APIs in Dynatrace where you can configure these things through the API, which means you can make it part of the deployment process. So your developers can say, hey, I have a new log message and this is very critical for me. So next time my app gets deployed, I want Dynatrace to automatically pick this log message up and give me a metric, and then maybe even alert me in case I reach a certain threshold.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Going back to our, what do we do with these metrics now if I'm looking to create an alert? So the 2 options we have are directly inside of this panel. So the first one would be under log monitoring, we have log events. Okay, so log events is, you'll notice my default Kubernetes log events here. So that's part of my Kubernetes integration. But if I were to add a log event, I could go through and input the same query. I don't even really require the metric at this point. So it depends on what your objective is. If your objective is just to simply open a problem, if you see this entry happen in any type of log, then you can do this without the usage of creating a metric. Once you input your query, your event template, and then you choose your event type. This is where you have the decision of, do I want this to just be informational? Maybe inside of your logs, there is like a deployment version or something relevant to a new deploy of your application. You could create info type events that just populate the entities that they match to. Otherwise, if I select something like an error or a resource or slowdown, these are the problem severity categories, and these are problem opening events. So if this query matches one time, opens a problem in the error category or resource category, et cetera, whichever you choose. And then of course, you have the other event types. This is essentially the same thing as using the events API endpoint. You're just doing so based off of a query.
Yeah. Hey, Josh, I just want to highlight something here because I'm talking a lot with customers around Dynatrace in your continuous delivery. And so one of the use cases is sending Dynatrace, for instance, a deployment event when you deploy a new app. Well, sometimes this is not possible, but if you do a new deployment and your deployment tool on the target machine, or even your app as it starts up, is creating an initial log entry that says starting up version XYZ, you could define a log event here that is looking at this particular log event. And with this, we are converting that log message into a deployment event, which means Dynatrace knows exactly when which version of your app was being deployed and when it started up. Or the other thing that I saw in there, I just had a recent conversation around when hosts are shut down on purpose. And there's an event called marked for termination. So if you're using configuration management tools that allow you to spin up or shut down hosts on purpose, then we could also pick the log message from that tool on that target machine and say, hey, gracefully shutting down, and then taking it, and then we can send the so-called marked for termination event, which means Davis knows if the host goes down, it is intentional. So a lot of great use cases here with the log events. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like you said, a lot of times the strategy is to maybe make a REST call directly from your CI/CD solution. Well, if you're not interested in going that route, but it's already captured in your logs, and you're making the same thing happen, you're just grabbing it from a different source.
Yeah.
So then the second type of alerting from your metrics that you create happens through, of course, anomaly detection and custom events for alerting. So let me just discard those changes and come down here to custom events for alerting. And this is where you would have greater flexibility over exactly what conditions match your problem. So if you want to specify that, okay, let's grab our metric, right? So I'll just search for log dot, which is my key. And I could say, okay, I want to be alerted if the broken pipe exception occurs, greater than X number of times per minute. Or I can also choose, hey, Dynatrace, go ahead and build a baseline for me and tell me when I deviate from that baseline. Just like you would any other metric, but that's the difference between creating a log event, which could be problem opening or non-problem opening, and then also having a metric created that can populate a custom event specifically for alerting that gives you the capability to specify, all right, if I see, this metric breach, because we're counting the number of entries. If it breaches, let's say 10 in a 10-minute period, then I want to go ahead and open up the problem. So I could just specify that I want to go ahead and create, something like this. And once I save this off, if we see that happen 10 times in a 10-minute period, then that's enough entries for me to go ahead and take action against that, open a problem, and let me know about it. Excellent. Cool. Any other questions there, Andy?
No, I'm just blown away because, as I said in the very beginning, I used to know a lot about Dynatrace, but now the product is growing so fast and new features are coming in all the time. And it's just fantastic to see. And I really I like to remind people that all of this can be fully integrated and embedded into your deployment strategy. That means think about configuration as code, monitoring configuration as code, how Dynatrace gets your logs, how it understands the logs, how it converts it to metrics, how it sets up your alerting. You can also configure everything as part of your deployment pipeline. You can put this configuration next to your source code, so the code and the monitoring configuration go hand in hand and get pushed through the environment, and that's phenomenal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Awesome. So with that, we've got our metrics created. We got a couple of them out there on the dashboard. Let's just populate the last one here. So we did log your total, and we'll sum that up. And I want to split that by the deployment. And let's say we want to go ahead and throw that in a pie chart or something of that nature. So right now, only my back end, of course, is triggering errors. But if my front end or my database starts to trigger some errors, then that'll populate and we'll throw that out on the same dashboard for us. All right. Excellent. So yeah, I encourage everybody watching this to certainly try out building your own views. This is certainly going to be more relevant to your own logging concepts and some of the patterns you may be looking for. I typically build multiple different tables that I want to continuously watch the content for. One thing to be aware of on the dashboard is that obviously this table is not going to stream for us, so you have to either change your time frame or refresh that to get the most recent content. But this is typically targeted for very specific queries that you might be looking for over a longer period of time. If you're looking for something up to date, then definitely the metric route is the way to go.
And Josh, also for people that want to know more about the dashboarding capabilities, in a recent observability clinic, I had our colleagues from the dashboarding side giving an overview of what's the latest on dashboard. So just go to the YouTube channel or in Dynatrace University and search for Power Dashboarding, and you'll find all the latest information.
Absolutely. All right. So we took a look at metrics as well as viewing, content in the viewer, populating some dashboards. We've got a couple of more features to show today, which would be understanding the usage of the generic Ingest API. So there's a few use cases with this, right? So now we can forward logs from not only one agent sources, but we talked about cloud providers. Not only can we do like cloud provider log forwarding, but you might have industry standard log shippers like Logstash or Fluentd in your existing ecosystems today. And with that, you can simply publish that to our HTTP endpoint to ingest log content from an aggregator such as Logstash or Fluentd, and get a lot more log content directly inside of Dynatrace. So I've got an example for us. We're just going to work with a very simple JSON structure, and we're going to go ahead and publish that to our environment. And then what the cool thing is, we can start to customize some of the attributes that we see with that. So it'll give us an example of not only utilizing the API, but also understanding how we can build some of our own custom attributes, which can then populate additional metrics. Okay, so let's go right back into the UI. So for this, I'm going to have to open up my profile icon and jump into our environment API v2. And the endpoint that we're interested in is logs. So within here, you'll see our logs/ingest. So this is the endpoint you would be pushing any type of log shipper to, or if your your cloud providers are doing log forwarding, this is ultimately what's consuming that log information. Here, we're just going to do a basic example of some content that I've got, and we're going to fire this off, and then we can take a look at what the results look like, as well as populating some additional attributes from it. So initially, it gives us this example schema. So you can send information to this endpoint in JSON or plain text. So you'll notice that the JSON payload accepts multiple events in a single payload, where the text or the plain text will accept one log event per payload. So you do have to make that, be aware of that difference. But right now, we're just going to go ahead and try it out. I do have to supply my token here. So let me just grab my API token real quick. Populate that in there. Excellent. All right, so now I've got my snippet of JSON. I'm going to go ahead and remove some of this content. I've got a little bit of a different scheme that I want to use. And essentially what this is I'm going to create some error level logs for this source called Skynet. And I've got some different applications and messages associated to that. So very, very simple JSON. But the key here is that we're going to have this application come through, and we'll be able to create potentially an attribute around that. So let's first fire this off. We should get a 204 to confirm that that is there. So what I'm going to do is actually fire that off a couple of times just to get an easy way to find it directly in my log viewer. And that should come through within the next 10 to 30 seconds. Go ahead and come back here and we'll do a refresh. All right, it may take another minute or two. And let's say we're just going to look for Skynet this time. So we can just type in Skynet for our content and just wait for this to fully process. Hopefully in the next 10 seconds or so.
Just a quick question, Josh. The absence of a timestamp means it takes the current timestamp, and can I also put kind of not historical data? I obviously cannot go back too far in history, but can I specify a timestamp here as well? Do you know?
Yeah, great point. You can. You certainly can support timestamp. Now, there is some requirements on the timestamp. So what I would recommend everybody do is take a look at the documentation. Actually, there's labels of formats and exactly what we're expecting to be there. But yes, absolutely, you can retroactively send log data to the API if you supply the correct timestamps. Otherwise, right now, what's going to happen is this information is going to come through with our current timestamp, right? Perfect. So if this did happen to be some, it was offset or there was a difference in time, then what you're viewing is the timestamps that Dynatrace received it, not the timestamps that may have actually came through the actual content of the logs. Yep. All right, so we should have that available there now. Oh, quite. Let's double check that my filter was correct. There we go. They are here. So my filter was just, coming through on the source rather. So the message is what I was trying to filter on, and it wasn't looking for Skynet. But anyway, so here is what we just sent through the API, right? I triggered that multiple times. So each time I triggered that API call, there was 4 separate events that were triggered, one for each type of service. So I've got the auth service, the ordering service, the cart service, and payment service, all coming through with error. Now, there's really not a ton of context related to this because we don't have any type of entity related to it, et cetera. But of course, we're in a demo environment working with very simplistic examples. But what I wanted to show now that we've got this content here is I have an application ID that's coming through, right? So one thing Dynatrace did recognize is based on my JSON content, it says, hey, I have an attribute of application.id, and that gives us the name of the application. Well, currently, there is no way for me to search or filter based on that attribute, right? Dynatrace recognizes it, but it doesn't automatically become an attribute over here. So if I tried to search for application.id, there is HTTP application ID, but that's not the same thing, right? It's something slightly different. So what I want to do is tell Dynatrace that, hey, I have an attribute that I would like you to detect in a custom fashion, and that can become a filter and also become a dimension in future metrics. So if I had a common scheme like this, and I wanted to know the number of errors split by application, that'd be a great use case for building a metric. So we're just going to go ahead and copy this ID here, work our way down into the settings. And then work our way down into log monitoring and log custom attributes. All right. And here I just need to specify the key. So this is application.id. Right. And yes, I do want to show this attribute in the sidebar. So there is a switch there if we want to be able to quickly view it, or if you just want it to be included in the drop-down list directly on the log viewer. So once I specify that, everything is case sensitive. So it should be all lowercase. And yep, it is. And we can just save that off. All right. And that's all we really needed to do, right? So if you are, let's go back to the log viewer. As we look at the ingested data in the other category of attributes, you just copy exactly what's displayed here, right? Which is our attribute defined in JSON. But if I had multiple, I could also look at the source. The source would be another attribute I could grab. So I wouldn't need like source.id, it would just be source, and then here is application ID. So if I come back and we re-execute this a couple of times to get us some more information, the next time
Skynet is evil today.
Yeah, it's not happy. The next time that this comes through, I should be able to find directly on the left-hand side, somewhere in this list, we'll have application.id. So let's go ahead and give this a refresh. Now, log content will stream, so it will be, you know, continuously refreshing, but for my impatience, right, I am just refreshing this manually. So here, let's say if we look for application, it probably will only come through once we actually have, so we do have it here, but it's not going to show up in this menu until we actually have our newest data. So I've just got to wait for that to come through, and we can just change our time frame there, and we should see, there we go. And let's try this again, application under the other. And in fact, here we have application ID. So even right off the bat, I can identify that my authentication service has 6 events.
Cool.
Right. And that's a filter that I could certainly apply. I could populate that into other types of queries, you know, and then here, so we're going to use that same exact thing where I want to know that there is going to be a metric to look for any type of error, and I want to group it by this attribute. So I really don't even have to populate too much other content, granted that this attribute is only available for these specific logs. So if my query is simply error and I split by the dimension of application ID, it's not going to give me a null value for this guy because it doesn't contain application ID. But preferably, we would, of course, filter it down further. You know, if I'm looking for some type of pattern within the message, you know, something like that. So I'm just going to say the log level is error and the content must contain failure. And that should get me to just this information. Then from here, we'll go ahead and just click the easy button, create metric. And this is our Skynet, you know, error application.id. So I always like to be descriptive on these keys. So it's mentioning that I'm targeting errors and I'm splitting by application ID. Here's my query. And then we're going to go ahead and add a dimension for, now I have that attribute available, right, where I did not have it before. So we save that off. And then, of course, once we fire some more data through, we'll be able to create, you know, a metric directly around that.
So to recap quickly on this before you chart it, that means this gives me the opportunity to specify custom index dimensions, because first of all, it's getting indexed, which means I can use it for automated filtering and I can use it in my log expression query. And then I can also use any of these custom fields then, or custom log attributes, even for calculated log metrics. That's also really nice. Yeah. That's
absolutely correct.
Powerful.
All right, so we'll just pin that out to the dashboard without any data yet, but it will come through just a minute. So this would be Skynet errors by application. And awesome. All right, so the next time we get a refresh on this, we should definitely populate it. Let's grab the, oops, I guess it won't give me the change there. I'll have to go back here. Visualization back to like a pie chart there. All right, perfect. Save that. And just fire this off a couple more times.
There you go.
There we go.
Cool.
Right. So awesome. Right. So that gives us a nice overview of utilizing the log viewer, customizing your views, building some dashboard data, customizing your own metrics. What happens if we use events versus custom alerting? All right. Adding your own attributes, like Andy talked about, the indexing, you know, all great stuff with the existing log features. I think now would be a great time to introduce, you know, what's coming down the pipe, because this is really just the beginning for us. So log context is currently available, right? So this is a feature that was released within the last few versions, I think maybe about 5 versions ago, but this is now allowing us to visualize a pure path directly from a log content. And actually, real quick, before we go further, I can come back and just quickly demo that here in this environment. So if I just say I want to find all of my backend deployments, you know, logs, I should be able to find an entry in here, regardless if it's error or else, where there is some trace information, right? Now, certain, these are the same exception, but sometimes, in this case, there was no trace attached to it. You're just looking for an entry that contains this trace. And there are some additional setup for this. So there is some documentation around making sure that everything's enabled, making sure the proper frameworks are supported for this to completely work. But it's pretty slick, right? Because not only can I take this entry that I found in a viewer and say, okay, view the trace, takes me right down into our distributed trace, right? So this is actually the transaction that occurred with all of the relevant metadata, my summary, very basic transaction in this case, but this is the log entry that stemmed from this trace. And I have the same code level visibility alongside this transaction that now provides the context that, hey, this particular transaction that happened at 1:53 in the afternoon on May 5th, here's the log entry for it. Where before, quite difficult to identify a specific trace for a given log entry, right? You were trying to match up timestamps and stuff like that, but now we just connect it for you.
And then if you click back on the summary, I think this is what I love about it, right? You can see the URL. You get all the context, the request context, right? The service and everything, and it's
which service it was, my request, all of that good stuff.
Yeah,
right?
And we did a observability clinic recently as well with Thomas Rothschädel, where I think it was called Logs in the Context of Distributed Traces. So if you're interested in more of this, also check out that particular session.
Awesome. Okay, so now what's coming to the product, right? So within Q2 of 22, the log viewer is going to get a little bit of a revamp. So still kind of similar to what we see today, but one of the main differences you'll notice is that you no longer have to expand the content of one of the entries. When you make a filter, right, you can search for this. So that's currently available. We saw that. The same thing happens for our filters up top. The query doesn't really change, but what does change is when I make a selection, all of our context drill downs happen on the right-hand side. So you can continue looking through other content in your viewer, have all of this information directly available to you. You'll notice now we are not only providing the context to the services side trace, but we can provide context to the user session as well. So now we're bringing RUM into the mix, right? Bringing that RUM data and including it with the back end all the way to the front end. So we can take a log entry and say, hey, this was the exact user that this particular entry happened for. And then of course the Dynatrace entities are there, messaging, and then directly from this screen, if I find an attribute that I'm interested in, hey, go ahead and filter my viewer to that attribute where I'm noticing that this particular host is generating a lot of entries based on which processes run on it. I want to filter to that and then show all entries in this list. So a little bit of a revamp to our UI in terms of the viewer. I think it's certainly welcomed. It's going to be nice to have that context directly to the user session, and then all of the relevant links to our other entities inside of our monitoring environment, right? Whether it's my hosts, my services, my processes, all of that's directly there for us. Additionally, we have a search for attributes. So you might have log content that carries a large number of attributes, and I just want to see if there is a particular key that I'm looking for in here. You got a quick search there as well. Next thing is going to be being able to process, generating custom processing during ingestion. So right now we just take the content as it is. Coming later this year, we will be able to define some parsing rules as well as the ability to extract things like attributes. So giving you better flexibility to process the JSON or XML structure with things like math operations, right? String and string manipulation. Okay, so you'll have user-defined rules for this raw data processing. You come into, this will be available directly in the settings. The example that I've got here is a parsing rule that says, I'm looking for content is equal to batch, and the parsing starts by looking for the job, the ID, the job name, the job time. So it's grabbing some, specific content related to this message And I don't really need a lot of the other attributes that are within this content. So I'm just looking for some specific components, and then I'm extracting attributes from that. And then this attribute can be recognized directly inside the viewer. So show me all entries by job ID. How many job IDs had failures today versus successful, related to this batch content that I'm pushing into the log viewer. So pretty cool stuff there as well. Here's another example of kind of that configuration. This is the same thing, just a little bit blown up. So we're actually doing a parsing rule. And then the nice thing is you'll be able to do some testing, right? So, that's kind of the hardest thing when we have a configuration that we just have to save, and I've got no way to validate if my rule is accurate based on what I'm trying to do. So you'll be able to test and preview this directly inside the content. You would provide Dynatrace with the sample string of what you're trying to parse, and it'll spit you out the output based on the rule that you've defined to verify you're getting exactly what you're looking for. All right. So a welcomed configuration is going to be the storage configuration. All right. Right now, inside of the current environments, you can either include all, exclude all, but include this, or include all, but exclude this type of scenario. We are going to have a much more scalable and flexible configuration for choosing which logs are going to be actually ingested by Dynatrace, especially when it comes to like selecting which one agents are going to send their logs and so on. So scalable configuration, right, for uploading auto-discovered or manual log sources when you need to change which sources of log. The configuration as code, as Andy mentioned earlier on, we're very heavily focused on APIs and being able to configure these settings as code. So this is all going to be API driven, as well as a UI option. Flexible rules based on the tenant, the host group, and the host level. So as an administrator to an environment, I may have to create rules for the tenant to kind of protect myself from somebody sending me too much log content at once, versus maybe I have individual application teams that can specify their own host level rules or their own host group level rules, something along that line. So we'll have some hierarchy of how these get processed, and they're always going to be processed in a priority of host to host group to tenant. So there's some additional rules in terms of how we can configure exactly what's going to be monitored inside of your environment. Okay. All right, the ability to filter and mask. So I think this is a big one, right? Because certainly a certain log content may not always be applicable for everybody to view or even to have Dynatrace ingest whatsoever. So masking sensitive data on the one agent level with SHA-1 or substituting with user-defined strings based on regular expression matching is all going to be applicable. You can filter this to drop the logs before sending it to storage with the support for wildcards. And we'll be able to match logs for masking and filtering content with, of course, the API again and some scoped rules. So anything you configure here is supported for configuration as code, but also providing you that flexibility of choosing not only which logs I'm planning to ingest, but the actual data that's carried within them to make sure we're not exposing something that could potentially be sensitive, and gives us the ability to mask that out, right? So you'll notice the example on the right here. We've got a user account definition with an email and a transaction ID. I could mask it with a string where I basically create the username as a placeholder in the entry, or I could mask it directly with, SHA-1. So just actually encode it there. Okay. And this is the configuration of that, being able to utilize either regular expressions. In this case, this is replacing with a string saying, okay, match all logs where email is found, and then update the replacement. So you're just doing a find and replace essentially using regular expressions, and making sure that that content doesn't get exposed, right? So that's coming towards Q3 of 2022. And then, throughout the end of the year, we're going to have many more updates coming to log analytics specifically that I'm definitely looking forward to. And these are going to be some welcomed additions to the flexibility of controlling exactly what type of content is going to be present inside of your Dynatrace tenant.
And for me, this is an open invitation to come back, Josh, to then show us all these cool things live. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Looking forward to it. So we'll definitely get some additional use cases in there and showcase maybe some more advanced rules or something. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So,
Awesome.
all right, that's about it, folks. The last thing I wanted to leave you guys with is just some resources. So we're just referencing our documentation here, but there are some certain considerations for things like managed environments when it comes to log analysis and log ingestion. So definitely take a look at that. What are some of our current limitations? Keep an eye there, because that's definitely going to change over the course of, this feature growth. And there are some data format things that we have to follow. So if you're having any type of troubleshooting issues, making sure your content's getting there, I think these are some good links, making sure that everything's flowing as expected. And then of course, the cloud provider forwarding on the bottom. I think that one's definitely a huge advantage to bring in some of your existing components. So
nice. Awesome. Hey, Josh, thank you so much for doing this. I want to just highlight again, as you're seeing this, you're either watching this on YouTube or on Dynatrace University. If you see it on Dynatrace University, you not only get the video, but also the read-only version of the slides. So in case you want to follow up with these links, obviously they are easy to kind of find, I guess, if you use your favorite search engine, but also make sure that you download the slides. I learned a lot of things. I'm really excited about what's actually happening in log analytics with Dynatrace. Really, for me, a couple of new ideas popped up, especially in my work around DevOps and automation. And then I'm really excited about that the opportunity that we have with configuring these things as code. So baking this into Monaco, baking this into your CI/CD pipeline. I think this is just huge. Thank you for all of the demos you've shown, Josh. And yeah, if people have questions, obviously they can always reach us. Either, as I mentioned earlier, leave a comment on where you see this content, or you have our names, right? Josh, I consider you as one of the experts. Hopefully people can reach out to you.
Absolutely.
And then the other thing is, if you really have questions and for whatever reason, neither of us responds, or you don't know how to get a hold of us, you can go to community.dynatrace.com. This is a place where you can ask questions to the whole community. You obviously have the in-product chat as well. So there should be plenty of opportunities to get your questions answered in case you have questions.
Awesome. Well, Andy, I really appreciate you letting me join in here and showing everybody about some log analytic features. And I hope to see you guys very soon. We'll be back for round 2.
Exactly. With this, have a good night. See ya.
See everybody.
Bye.